كفروا الله فآمنت طائفة من بني إسرائيل وكفرت طائفة فأيدنا الذين آمنوا على عدوهم فأصبحوا ظالمين.
O believers, shall I guide you to an exchange that will save you from a painful punishment? It is to have faith in Allah and His Messenger, and strive in the cause of Allah with your wealth and your lives. That is best for you, if only you knew. He will forgive your sins and admit you into the gardens underneath which rivers flow, and house you in splendid homes in the gardens of eternity. That is the ultimate triumph. He will also give you another favour that you long for, help from Allah and an imminent victory. So give good news, O Prophet, to the believers. O believers, stand up for Allah, as Isa, son of Maryam, asked the disciples, who will stand up with me for Allah? The disciples replied, we will stand up for Allah. Then a group from the children of Israel believed while another disbelieved. We then supported the believers against their enemies, and so they prevailed.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillahi alladhi hadana lihadha wa ma kunna linahtadiya lawla an hadana Allah. Laqad ja'at rusulu rabbina bil haqq. Wa salawatullah ala an-nabi حبيب قلوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا وشفيع ذنوبنا الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تبعهم إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. Inshallah, today is a discussion about the issue of today. Which is undoubtedly known to you all, whether Muslim, non-Muslim, human or not human. It is the issue of Israel and Palestine. And before I get into the crux of the presentation, inshallah, I wanted us to reflect on some of the ayat that were recited by the President Mikhail and translated by Sama. And those ayat were a relating of a parable about the time of Isa alayhi salam, Isa ibn Maryam, who grew up in the land that is currently under devastation today, which is Palestine. And very similar to the people of Palestine, Isa ibn Maryam was also somebody who held no authority. He was a man who was persecuted. He was a man who was displaced from his lodgings and his birthplace in Bethlehem. And he was a man who was going to be put to death, just like the Gazans are pretty much put to death as we speak today. And Isa alayhi salam said to his companions, the Hawariyin, or as we know them in the English language, the disciples, who is going to be the one, or who are the ones that will help me? Who are the ones that are going to support me during this time where I have become displaced, massacred, about to be put to death, and rejected for the message that I carry to the people of the region? And the Hawariyin said, Nahnu Ansarullah, we are the helpers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Assalamu alaikum. And in the same spirit, Insha'Allah, we should also be, or aspire to be, helpers of those people who are oppressed. Not just restricted to the people of Gaza, but also those who are oppressed throughout the world, Insha'Allah. The current reality is that there are approximately 8,000 people who have died. The current reality is that of those 8,000 people, approximately 3,000 people are children. 24 journalists have been killed within the Gaza Strip. 104 people have been killed in the West Bank during exactly the same period. Al-Ahli Hospital was completely razed to the ground, and Ash-Shifa Hospital is about to be razed to the ground. The Israeli death toll is 1,400 people, which is a sizable death toll, of course, nonetheless. And there is an impending ground offensive that is going to happen from the Israelis into Palestinian Gazan territory. The Israeli reality is that there is regional and even domestic political repercussions at the moment within Israel. The international reality is that the President of the United Kingdom, Rishi Sunak, the President of or the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and the President of the United States, Joe Biden, and even the leaders of the various different political parties within the UK, including Keir Starmer, have made their position incredibly clear concerning the conflict. In fact, as of a few hours ago, there was a Cobra meeting within London about the implications of the Israeli-Palestine issue on minorities within the UK, with the view to potentially outlawing the displaying of flags like that and flags like this. That's the current reality today, and it's in this context we're having this conversation. This is a graph showing the number of deaths since 2008 until now. And deaths on both sides are sad, no doubt, especially when they involve innocent people. But we can see that the number of deaths has been huge. And in this episode of the conflict, the number of deaths is almost 4 times that which was in 2014, which was the last concerted offensive from Israel towards Gaza. We also see over the last 40 to 50 years a growth of settlements. Israeli settlements on what has been stipulated as Palestinian land. This is throughout the West Bank territories in particular. Prior to 2004, they were in Gaza, and then the decision was made for Israel to pull out of Gaza. However, they continued to be built within the West Bank. In these circumstances, people who have lived and their families that have lived on land for centuries are displaced overnight by settlers who are accompanied by police officers and also army personnel from the occupying entity. This is another map showing the disintegration of what is known as Palestine. Going from 1946, which was Palestine under the British mandate, and then 1947 under the UN Resolution 181, and then subsequently in 67 and 2010, and I'm telling you the area is even smaller now. The current reality in Palestine is that there are 175 permanent checkpoints. Just last year, 950 houses were demolished, displacing 1,031 Palestinians. Every single Ramadan, every single year, there is a raid on Masjid al-Aqsa. Every single year. And last year, this is 2022, 400 people were arrested. The figures from 2023 haven't been announced. And in the meantime, you also have thousands of Ukrainians settled who have been brought over and settled in Israel. Displacement from one side and settlement from the other side. You've had 30,000 African asylum seekers who have had their applications rejected. Trust me, there's plenty of space from the occupying territory. Gaza has been described as an open-air prison, with Amnesty International, for example, explaining that it is the current land of the West Bank and Gaza is under a system of apartheid. There was also a UN Independent International Commission that was launched and that went into the occupied territories and concluded that the creation of settlements contravenes international law, whatever that is, and we'll explain that. In August 2022, 49 people were killed in Gaza. 151 people were killed in West Bank.
I just have one question. Could you clarify the open air prison concept a bit more? Because like, is it like just between Israel and Gaza, or is it like kind of circular around Gaza?
I will explain, inshallah. I will explain. You've had the deaths of foreign personnel, journalists. Shireen Abu Akleh, who was from Al Jazeera, who was sniped in her head, initially denied any involvement of Israel and then subsequently accepted. And for those who may have seen, Wa'il al-Dahdur, whose wife, daughter, son and grandchildren were all killed through a bombing. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. This is the current reality. And I think for those people who are switched on, will be wondering how the Jahannam did this happen? How the hell did this happen? Because this is despite a number of different resolutions, a number of different UN resolutions. So for example, you have UN Resolution 446, and I'm going to read them out. Israeli settlements in occupied territories, including the West Bank and East Jerusalem, have no legal validity. The General Assembly Resolution, which is the next one down, once again, the illegality of Israeli settlements in the West Bank. This is 2016. The Fourth Geneva Convention, Protocol 1. So the Geneva Convention, the Fourth Geneva Convention, prohibits the occupying power for transferring civilians into occupied territories. Protocol 1, blockages, such as the current blockage of fuel, of water, of electricity, must comply with principles of distinction, i.e. a clear distinction between military objectives and civilian objects. Blockades must be proportionate, i.e. confer military advantage versus the harm to civilians. Article 23 and 70, humanitarian aid must be allowed to be delivered. Blockages must not be indefinite. The International Court of Justice in 2004, the Israeli construction of separation barriers in West Bank is in violation of international law and constitutes an apartheid. The Oslo Accords, which we'll come to, the West Bank and Gaza should form a single territorial unit, which was also signed by Israel. The international law, Rule 158, the blockade must be reviewed by the party imposing it. Violations can result in legal accountability. The situation is despite the Arab-Israeli war in between 48 and 49, the Six-Day War in 67, the Yom Kippur War in 1973, the First and the Second Lebanese War, and the multiple intifadas that we've had since then. This is despite the bloodshed, the oppression occurs despite all of these international conventions, all of these wars, and also international treaties such as the Camp David Agreement, the Oslo Accords in 1993, 1995, and also the review of the Oslo Accords of 2000, and most recently the Abraham Accords, which is the Trump peace plan. The situation is dire. The situation is bad. The situation has just gotten worse. And the first point that I want to make is that October the 7th was not the start of everything. despite what the world is telling everybody else, despite what media and governments are telling everybody else, October the 7th was not when the Palestinian-Israeli conflict started. This has been going on for 75 years. There's been systematic displacement, obstruction, killing, oppression of people for the last 75 years. So for anybody who says that October the 7th was the start, is completely deluded. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu attaqullah wa qulu qawlan sadida. He says, O you who believe, have taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and say, qulu qawlan sadida. Speak straight up. Be brave in your speech, right? Sadda is to create a crack in something, right? Is to create a crack in something. Or the linguists would say, it's to fill a crack. So if somebody is creating a narrative around you, or about a particular thing which is untrue, and as Muslims we are people of truth, it's important to always take the challenge head on and be steadfast with regards to the truth and the speech, Insha'Allah. So the point of this presentation is to dispel a number of incorrect narratives through exploring the history of the region over the last 75 years and even slightly before. So we can learn the history of the conflict, and we can therefore reply to people who point fingers at us, those who defend innocent people who are dying, and reply with no compromise, not angrily, but appropriately and correctly, which is in the spirit of Islam and is upon the Sunnah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Last session, we spoke about a number of things. We spoke about the fall of the Ottomans, the division of the Arab lands through the adoption of the nation state. And then we also briefly spoke about the Balfour Agreement, which we'll come to now. And the modern world was created in the image of everything that happened. And the following ideas became the assumptions behind the modern world: that religion and the state are to be separated. This was imposed, this was transposed on the Muslim world. That religion and the state are to be separated. That nation states based on language and culture are better than pan-national empires. Individualism and not family is the bedrock of society. And minorities are apparently best represented in democratic governance. And this was an entirely European experience. And it was the European experience that was transplanted and transposed on the East. And this isn't just restricted to the Muslim world. This is restricted far beyond this is expanded to far beyond the Muslim world. The second thing that I want to disband is that anti-Semitism didn't start with Muslims. And for anybody to say that any discussion on the issue of Palestine and Israel, the conflict, for some reason is anti-Semitic, is a red herring, and ultimately is a straw man argument. Because anti-Semitism did not start with Muslims. The Jewish problem is not a Muslim phenomenon. It's not an Arab phenomenon. It's a European phenomenon. The reality is, when it came to the history of Jews in Europe, and it's very important to understand this, is that Jews existed in Central and Eastern Europe for centuries. And the reality is and was that they were a highly persecuted community within Europe. They were barred from owning property, working in respected professions, and prejudiced against. This didn't come from Muslims, right? Let's be straight up. This did not come from Muslims. They were forcibly converted to Christianity, or they were forced to deprive themselves of their own culture. Hebrew became a lost tradition. Yes, it was understood through writing, but it ceased to become a spoken language because Jews were stopped from speaking Hebrew. Has anybody watched this movie? The Merchant of Venice.
I've read the play.
Read the play. Interestingly, a Guardian journalist, well, the illustrator for the Guardian over the last 30 years was actually recently sacked by the Guardian because he drew a picture of Netanyahu, and on that picture was his belly, and there was part of his belly being taken out, which was, you know, the flag from his flesh, and this illustrator was accused of recreating the character that Al Pacino plays in The Merchant of Venice, which is Shylock. And The Merchant of Venice was a play that was written by Shakespeare, and a lot of the stereotypes that go around, and they're unfortunate, and we don't condone racism as Muslims, we don't condone anti-Semitism, but a lot of the stereotypes, right, and as minorities we're subject to stereotypes too, unfortunately, but a lot of the stereotypes that have become popularized in terms of, you know, Jewish people didn't start from Muslim circles or Arab circles, they started from European circles, right? They started from European circles. You had famous affairs like the Dreyfus affair in France as an example. Does anybody know what this building is?
Is that in York?
York, yeah.
That's that castle with the Jews killed themselves.
Yeah, this Clifford Tower in York. And does anybody know what happened in Clifford Tower?
Was there not a pogrom against the Jews there in like the 1200s with the King John's reign or something?
Correct. There was a pogrom against Jews, right? And they hid in this castle. I'm not going to go through the whole story, but there was heavy persecution of Jewish people in Europe, is my point. Post-French Revolution, post-Enlightenment, right, in inverted commas, it didn't end because they ceased to be accepted in society. They became grievances. Well, they became scapegoats for political grievances, right? There was persecution of Jews in Russia and Italy. Who's heard of the Illuminati? Right. When I was growing up, which wasn't long yet, I'm 30 years old, yeah, but anyway, when I was growing up, there used to be this show called The Arrivals on YouTube, right? And it was like about like the Illuminati and the Freemasons, and there was consistent reference to this book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, right? Has anybody heard of this book or this parchment? Yeah. So this parchment was discovered, this lady had it apparently, and this lady said that I found it in the possession of this guy that I was, you know, committing adultery with, yeah. And then, you know, he found it, he got it from some Freemasons, and then he found it and anyway, you know, it became the bedrock of so many different stereotypes and tropes against Jews. But it was a document that was actually created by the Tsars in Russia. This is proven, yeah? By the Tsars in Russia, right? And it created this global conspiracy that the Jews were going to take over the world. It's absolute rubbish, right? It's absolute rubbish. But as a Muslim guy, and as parents, a guy who has parents who has Muslims, trust me, you know, this fabricated document, right, is referred to in many, many different ways by Muslims, non-Muslims, Europeans all over the world, right? Oh, there's this global conspiracy. It was fabricated, right? But it was part of this wave of anti-Semitism that was raging through Europe. And then World War II, of course, saw the tragic death of lots of Jews. The history of Jews in the Muslim world, and I need to make this point, it needs to be very, very clear, was very, very different. Jewish citizenship was recognized in Al-Andalus, right? And I'm not making our history flowery. They had to pay taxes, a citizenship tax, a tax. Jews couldn't take positions in hukuma, in ruling, right? But they were able to take administrative positions, right, within the caliphate. Jewish academics credit the rediscovery of Jewish culture through their re-engagement with their own scripture throughout the Muslim world, not throughout Europe. Jews were accepted into mainstream society, intellectual circles, trading circles. When the Spanish Inquisition happened, the Reconquista, Jews were then taken and invited by the Ottomans. In the end, there were 150,000 Jews in the Muslim world when only 75,000 Jews in Europe. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about Banu Israel. Ya Bani Israel, اذكروا نعمتي التي أنعمت عليكم وأني فضلتكم على العالمين. We recognize that they were the chosen people. We recognize that they are the people of the book. We recognize that we can have their meat. We recognize that we can live in cohesion with them. Muslims have no issues with Judaism. And I have to make that point abundantly clear. Because we've got to get rid of all of these, the ammunition, unfortunately. This is, does anybody know? Theodor Herzl. He is credited to be the father of Zionism. And in 1896 published The Jewish State and then later The Old New Land. And in this wave of anti-Semitism that was raging and that was termed as the Jewish problem. Because in Europe, Europeans never, unfortunately, didn't see Jews as becoming part of mainstream society. Not because of anything else other than nationalism, right? Nationalism. The Jews in France were not being seen as French. The Jews in Russia were not being seen as Russians. So the Jews who were being persecuted, not accepted into society, naturally wanted to have a place where they can call home. It's a natural consequence. So Theodor Herzl started to go around the entirety of Europe. And he had this dream of having a Jewish state, right? Actually, a state. It only later became Jewish after a number of stakeholders got included within the Zionist movement. The famous incident where he went to Sultan Abdul Hamid II, rahmatullah alayh. And Sultan Abdul Hamid II, despite the Ottomans being in the most weakest of positions, and despite being in need of the money, because they were in a lot of debt, as we discussed, did not give Palestine to Theodor Herzl. He was offered Argentina, and Argentina became a potential proposition. Uganda was offered to him as well. That became a potential proposition. And then you had the banking industry, or more specifically the Rothschild family, who then also started to have a stake in the Zionist project. And World War I was ultimately where the British became interested. Now when it comes to Zionist philosophy, and I'm not going to go into the details, that requires another 2 hours. However, when it comes to Zionist philosophy, the Zionist philosophy is very similar to European colonial philosophy, right? And I'm going to prove the point. I'm going to prove the point, inshallah. Okay? It's very, very similar to European colonial philosophies. The same ideas that we spoke about here, which coined the modern world as a result of Europe's fight with each other, became the basis upon which the Zionist state was going to be established. God was going to be divorced from politics. It was going to be a nationalist state only for Jews. Individualism will always be the bedrock of society. The wider society would have there was never going to be any concern for, and minorities are best represented in democratic governance. In other words, the majority will always rule over the minority. And it was in that image the Zionist state was being proposed. Edmund James de Rothschild, who was the biggest financier of the Zionist state. And this is a quote, and I'm going to read the quote out. The idea of the colonization of Palestine is moreover connected with the remarkable colonization impetus that is taking over the entirety of the modern world. Britain in India, France in Algeria, the Dutch in South Africa, Belgium in Africa, etc., etc. Judged by outward characteristics are the European migration to foreign land, their colonization and development. So is this different from the feature of Jewish aspirations? Do you see where the inspiration is coming from? Exuberant energy finds no appropriate outlet in Europe, i.e. we have no space in Europe. So seek it far away, where it may be usefully employed in the furthering of civilization in the midst of backward countries and nations. Fruitful Jewish energy, which is kept under in the diaspora, will be gathered and transplanted in Palestine, that it may remain true to itself and to the whole of civilization. This is quoted from the History of Zionism. The inspiration was European foreign policy. And this culminated in what is known as the Balfour Agreement. And the British ultimately became interested in World War I. And we spoke about the various different treaties and the carving up of the Arab Muslim world during this time. And Palestine was particularly important for a number of reasons. The region had multiple historical crusades in the name of Palestine. It was important to Napoleon. It was important to the popes in the past. And it was important to people. And there are a number of books, actually. The author, I forget, Michael something. He's written a book called The Bible and Colonialism, right? And he takes a number of different case studies. This is no gripe on Christianity, by the way, but it's an explanation of how biblical verses were being used in order to justify settler colonialism throughout the Americas, etc. It connects Africa and the Middle East, right? Connects Africa and the Middle East, Palestine, and is ultimately the route to India, right? It was the route to India, which was very, very important for the British. This was all, of course, married with the Zionist call for a homeland, right? A Zionist call for a homeland. And this is not to take away, by the way, from the persecution that the Jews faced in Europe, right? It was a difficult circumstance. However, it didn't need to become what it became. And then you had powerful families, the Rothschilds, and other families who became part of the Jewish lobby. Now we can't talk about the region without talking about the USA. So I've made 4 points so far. The conflict didn't start on October the 7th. We have to understand the conflict and the regional politics. Anti-Semitism didn't start with Muslims. It was a European problem. Zionism was ultimately an extension of European colonial foreign policy. So when World War II was about to start, so between World War I and World War II, you had Palestine that was under the British mandate after the promise that Balfour had made to the Zionist lobby. And in 1939, a renewed promise was made, and this is the White Paper of 1939. The White Paper of 1939 was released as a result of further persecution of Jews within Europe, particularly by Germany, right? Particularly under Hitler. And there was a renewal of the promise to the Jews for a homeland in Palestine, right? It didn't have to be in Palestine. Remember, Argentina, Uganda. It could have been anywhere else in the world, right? There's an interesting map on social media that shows, Israel's map transplanted in the British Isles, right? It could have been anywhere in the world. It could have been Europe, but it wasn't. It stipulated the number or the annual number of Jews that could migrate. And it didn't outline a Jewish state, so it was kept purposefully vague. Now, this was perhaps quite difficult in the circumstance, especially for the Jews, because they were being persecuted. And if you imagine increased persecution of Jews on one side and the British state saying, actually, I'm going to limit the number of Jews that can enter at this time, so you've got to bear with the persecution, right? So of course that was never going to go down well, right? Then you had the entering of the United States of America, and subsequently in the subsequent lectures the USA is going to feature much more. I haven't spoken about the USA at all until this point, because this is where the USA enters. Does anybody know this geezer?
FDR.
Yeah.
Who's that?
President Roosevelt.
Roosevelt. Okay.
Second World War.
Correct. So what was Roosevelt famous for?
3 terms. 41 after Pearl Harbor, he helped join the war, and he helped reverse the depression, the effects of the economic depression.
Correct.
Centralize the American state.
Yes.
More than it was before.
Absolutely. Now, America for a long time, because remember, America was ultimately a settler colonial state. It was made up of Europeans who had gone over because they couldn't get to India, right? It's always the jewel, right? At that point, couldn't get to India because the Ottomans were blocking the sea routes, right? And going around Africa was a bit too long. I mean, I get that, right? So they thought they'd go the other way. So they went the other way, and Columbus found the Americas, right? And initially he thought he came across Indians, people like me from my heritage. But of course, they weren't Indians. That's why they were called American Indians. And then you had colonies that settled: the French, the British, the Americans. The Spanish, the Portuguese, etc. And for a long time, you had the War of Independence, which then subsequently allowed America to become independent from Britain, which was the last colony remaining, because Britain either kicked out or bought out the other colonial powers. And America remained isolated for a long time, right? They remained isolated for a long time. They didn't want to get involved in global politics. You had the discovery of crude oil in 1859, right? 1859. Very good film called There Will Be Blood. Beautiful film by Daniel Day-Lewis, right? Who's a brilliant actor, and it's definitely worth watching. And then you had the entry of Roosevelt as the President of the United States of America, and Roosevelt ended the American isolation. The reason why he ended the American isolation, because for him, and there's a writer called Robert Kagan, who's a very good writer, and he talks about American decline. Is America declining power in the world? But he writes about the history of this period. Roosevelt came out all guns and blazing, essentially saying that the USA now needs to play a more active role in shaping the world. A more active role in shaping the world. And he also equated the Jewish struggle for a homeland with the American struggle for independence. Right? With the American struggle for independence, right? And he said that the United States of America have something to give to the world, which is the 4 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And his mantra was that we're going to end colonialism, because we ended colonialism. We freed ourselves from the British, the French, the Spanish, and the Portuguese. And, you know, not to spoil the story, but, you know, it was just another colonial policy in reality. So in Europe, you had growing frustrations. Nazi aggression was growing, and there were some hideous things that were happening with Jews that were living in Europe. The US pressure on Europe was increasing, because the Jewish population in the US were obviously picketing and lobbying the US government, who was getting more involved under the Marshall Plan as an example. And you also had Christian populations within the USA, particularly evangelical Christians, right? Who are quite a strong lobby within the USA, right? And for them, the Jewish struggle for a homeland or Zionism, as I mentioned, is the same as the American route to freedom. The French were putting more pressure on the British. So Charles de Gaulle was sending ships filled with Jews to Palestine secretly, right? So the amount of Jews that were going to Palestine was increasing more and more, right? And then you also had the rise of insurgency movements. So, as in the period? So this is between about 1939 to about 1944. Okay? So around World War II. I think I lost my page. It's all right. So, now, what's very, very interesting, and this is another trope, terrorism did not start with the Muslim world. And terrorism did not start with Muslims. Let's be absolutely crystal clear on that issue, inshallah. You can argue that what happened in this period was no less than what is considered to be, on international standards today, terrorism. Because the growing frustration amongst the Jewish populations that were residing within Palestine already, those frustrations were not, echoed or communicated through diplomacy or through voting or through parliament or through local councils or anything like that. It was bombings, it was kidnappings, it was bombs planted in the briefcases and letters of British politicians. It was abductions. Have any of you guys heard of the Irgun or the Stern Gang or the Haganah, right? These were Jewish insurgency movements, right? This is a poster from the time of when these insurgency movements actually started to come into existence. There was growing frustration at the turn of World War II. This is a picture of the bombing of the King David Hotel, right? The bombing of the King David Hotel, which resulted in the death of 91 people, right? It also contained within it the British Colonial Office, right, where the administrative offices were, but it was also a functioning hotel. So you had the death of civilians and you had the death of people who were just carrying out their normal day job. You had the bombing of tanks, the killing of military personnel. You had the killing of British politicians, such as Lord Moyne, who was the British foreign envoy to Egypt at the time. You had letters that had bombs in them that were sent to Prime Minister Clement Attlee, right? And you had the abduction, which was known as the Sergeant's Affair, of 2 British soldiers who were eventually killed, right? This was the reality of the Jewish insurgency movement, right? The reality is that they weren't Jewish, right? They were Zionists, right? They call themselves the Jewish insurgency movement, but there is a separation between Judaism and Zionism, and I can say that, but you've got rabbis that are saying that today. So in terms of the region, in terms of Palestine and Israel, or the occupying entity, right? The first terrorists, the first people who disrupted peace in that area were not the Palestinians. It was the Zionists, right? And this is the evidence for that. And what's very interesting, by the way, is that when governments today say that we don't want to talk to, we don't want to talk to, before it was Cuba, we don't want to talk to Cuba because they are communists. We don't want to talk to Vietnam because we're at war with them. We don't want to talk to Afghanistan because they're the Taliban, right? Who, by the way, we supported many years ago. We don't want to talk to Hamas because they're a terrorist organization. The leaders of the insurgency movements subsequently became the government in waiting for the State of Israel. They were literally the terrorists one day, and they literally became the heads of state the next day. So terrorism is not defined by actions, it's defined by rhetoric and foreign policy. You then had the disastrous UN resolution 181 or 181 of 1947. And I have to mention this because the UN was formed after the League of Nations. Does anybody know what the League of Nations was there for? Go on.
It was formed after World War I
To?
restore peace.
Right, and?
I'm not sure.
Keep it. Keep it.
And keep it. Right? And keep it. So the League of Nations was developed after World War I to restore peace and to keep it, to stop Europe, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, to stop European nations from fighting each other, right? I mean, that clearly failed, right? Because you had World War II.
Is it them who are the members of the Security Council?
Inshallah, I will come to the Security Council and the General Assembly, yeah? Because there's an important distinction that's important. So, the UN was another go at it. But the UN was ultimately, and is ultimately, an extension of US foreign policy, right? Because it was the US that then designed the UN, of the remnants of the League of Nations. The UN then decided on this partition plan. Because the British, after the pressure and after the havoc and the terrorism caused by the insurgency movement, defaulted the decision to the UN. And the UN decided on this partition plan. The reality is that the Arabs were present from the start, with very small communities of Jews. There was not a consolidated community of Jews living in Palestine for approximately 2,000 years. If I'm being generous, I'm going to say 1,800 years. If I'm being real, it's 2,000 to 2,300 years. There was no consolidated Jewish presence. There were communities though, and they were existing in peace, and they could go to the Wailing Wall, and they could carry on their day and their pilgrimage. The resolution announced the establishment of the two-state solution. I'm sure everybody knows about the term two-state solution. The key point here is that it started as a two-state solution. It started as a two-state solution, right? Or solution. And 75 years later, we're still saying the same thing. The Zionists were given 53% of the land, despite only populating 1/3 of the region. The Arabs were given 47% of the land, despite populating 2/3 of the region. And if you look, so the grey is the Palestinian territory, or supposed to be the Palestinian territory. And if you look at, for example, what is termed as the Israeli territory, you will see this change as time goes on. But it wasn't as simple as this. You had what was called the commencement of the Nakba, right, which is the catastrophe or the calamity.
So, do you know who and why designed the borders? Because it seems very random.
It's very colonial. A lot of weird lines.
But like, it doesn't really make sense for even Jerusalem to be the international capital.
Absolutely.
So within Palestinian land, for example.
Absolutely.
Like 2 bits of Israel, bit of Palestine.
Of course. So, yeah. So.
No, but at least that makes sense.
It's like very unique. It was still like split cities and random countries, not a new.
Absolutely. I mean, it was like that, yeah? And in 2 weeks' time, we're actually going to be talking about the partition of another land, which happened in exactly the same time period, which was the subcontinent. But ultimately, the policy, the British policy was, at that time, and I'll go into it, it's called Balkanization, right? It's a British policy of Balkanization. And Dickie Mountbatten, right, who was the one who was the geezer who essentially split up India and Pakistan. He quotes using the word balkanization many times. And balkanization is ultimately a policy of separating homogeneous people, right, homogeneous people along ethnic lines. right? So separation happens on the accord of where Muslims are, where Jews are, or where Slavs are, or where Serbs are, or where Croats are, etc. But there's always going to be areas that are contested, right? So for instance, historically, the reason why Jerusalem was always under international kind of, it was then subsequently managed by Jordan, right? But it was under kind of, it wasn't decided on, was that there were too many communities living in a single place, right? But the rest of the region was supposed to be in line with where Muslims are based and where Jews are based. But that never really happened, to be honest. Did you have a follow-up question?
You said there was balkanization was like a British policy. Wasn't this made by the UN or not?
No, so the actual maps of how this was going to be divided and where the Jewish state was going to be created was actually defined by the British, right? But the actual division of the land was defaulted to the UN, primarily because the British still wanted to hold their colonial rule in the Arab lands, right? And they didn't want to upset both parties. That's why they defaulted. It wasn't out of, we're not going to make the decision. It was out of, we're going to default because we want to maintain our interests, right? So you had the comment, oh sorry.
You mentioned the Jewish people at the time only having a third of the population. I've also heard the number quoted, 25%.
Yeah, so I'm being conservative with the numbers, right? The actual numbers we'll never know, right? Because there's a mistransmission, unfortunately, from both sides, yeah? But conservative figures, or UN figures, are 33%, about 30 to 33%. So, the Nakba happened. By the way, please ask questions, inshallah. It's not a problem, okay? It's your session, and I'm not your lecturer. The Nakba, 1948, the catastrophe. So the Israeli army, which became the Israeli army, was composed of the insurgency groups, right? So the terrorists became the political leaders, right, overnight. For example, eventual prime ministers such as Ben Gurion, Begin, Rabin, these were all people who were part of the insurgencies, but were accepted by the international community, whoever that is, right? Instead of sticking to the UN mandate, which, by the way, the Palestinians were not happy with. Of course they're not going to be happy with it, right? They were kept in the dark all this time. They took 60% of Palestinian land, and 80% of Palestinians were displaced to bordering lands, right? 80% of Palestinians at the time were displaced to places like Jordan, to places like Lebanon, to places like Syria. If you go to Jordan, Syria, etc. today, you still have refugee camps, right? That are now made into small towns, right? Even the Jordanian population, I'm not sure the stats, but a large proportion of the Jordanian population today are Palestinians, the Falastinis, yeah? So you had a huge exodus of people who were indigenous to that land for the best part of 2,000 years being kicked out. In come the Arab armies, which was the first Arab-Israeli war. In come the Arab armies. But of course, the Arab armies, and this is the next point. This is the next point. The Arabs, the nations that are around Palestine, are complicit in the situation that the Palestinians face today. They are complicit. They have facilitated. They have allowed it. They have created it. They've sustained it. I don't know any more synonyms. But they are a big part of this. And in the first Arab-Israeli war, the seeds of nationalism were so strong within the Jordanians, the Syrians, the Egyptians, and we will continue to see how strong it was subsequently, inshallah, in the remainder of this. And I have no idea what the time is at the moment, but I'm going to keep rattling on. You will see that the situation carried on. So when the Arab armies came in, and multiple studies have been done, and I can send a reference link about these studies, but the main armies were not even deployed in the first Arab-Israeli war. It was the fringe armies, many of whom were under the leadership of British generals. So the Jordanian army was under General Glub Pasha, right, who was a British general. right? And his instruction was just go as far as Transjordan.
Would you say then the Arab armies sent are more like their paramilitaries?
Absolutely.
Local forces?
Absolutely. It was paramilitary, it was local forces. There was no seriousness. There was no seriousness at all. And they were under British and French instruction at the time. So then we move on, inshallah. We move on and we look at the subsequent period. So this is 1947 on, and now we're going to go all the way into really contemporary times. And we specifically look at Arab responses. In 1967, you had the 6-Day War. The context of the 6-Day War, and it's important to know the context of the 6-Day War, is something that is dubbed by political writers as the Anglo-American struggle within the Middle East. The Anglo-American struggle within the Middle East. The Anglo-American struggle within the Middle East was an attempt of the USA and Britain to try and maintain its colonial hold within the Middle East. This wasn't necessarily in the shape of physical colonization, but was ultimately in the shape of intellectual or resource colonization, in particular oil, right? Yeah. And it was enacted through many mechanisms. And we're not going to talk about this today in detail. This will be a feature, not in the next session, but the section after, inshallah. As part of the US's attempt to obtain influence over the Middle East, there was something called the Eisenhower Doctrine. The Eisenhower Doctrine. Does anybody know what the Eisenhower Doctrine was? Anybody heard of?
You play the Middle Eastern countries up against each other in order to weaken the ones that back by the USSR and strengthen your own allies.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was kind of in a Cold War setting. But the Eisenhower Doctrine is a little bit more specific than that, right? The Eisenhower Doctrine essentially is that if you as a nation feel threatened, you can get military support from the US, right? Because for the US, it means more bases and it means more control, right? So it was altruism. It's wolves in sheep's clothing, really. It was altruism, but with political interests on board.
Did he not say like one thing to the King of Jordan and then the complete opposite to Nasser?
Yes, he did. Yes, I'll come to Nasser in a second. So you had the Eisenhower Doctrine. And as part of this doctrine, you had a number of different issues that occurred. One of this was Abdel Nasser and the Suez Canal. The Suez is one of the most important global trade routes in the world. 17% of world trade passes through the Suez Canal. Okay? It's a massive amount, yeah? 17% of world trade. Now, Britain and France wanted to regain control of the Suez. So they incited Israel to increase the amount of goods passing through the Suez Canal. The United States of America, on the other hand, instructed Abdel Nasser to stop the passage of British and French goods via Israeli ships through the Suez Canal. Yeah, the Anglo-American struggle, right? So you have the US on one side and you have Britain and France on the other side. Abdel Nasser, through promises, that's what you were talking about, promises from the USA, decided to launch a war against Israel. Right? Launch a war against Israel. At the time, Abdel Nasser was very confident. He felt that he could, beat anybody at the time. But actually, that was far from the truth. There was poor preparation. Once again, there wasn't enough time for the main armies to come out. And Abdel Nasser had forgotten that the Eisenhower Doctrine also protects Israel. And for the USA, it was the key way that the USA managed to obtain or wrestle control or political control of Israel from the United Kingdom. right? Because it said, now that you're under attack, don't worry, we're going to protect you, Israel, right? Therefore, we're your friends and we're your partners. And you can see the result of that relationship today. Next question.
Sorry, I got a bit confused. You explained that they told us that to the more goods through the Suez Canal. At the same time, what did they tell Abdul Nasser?
Yes.
I'm confused why they asked that.
So the British and the French asked Israel to take more of their goods through the Suez Canal. The US instructed Abdul Nasser to block the passage of goods, right? So contrary to British and French interests. But the reason why the US did that was that it ultimately knew that Abdul Nasser will react and will attack Israel. And now the US was in position to now protect Israel, right? Under the Eisenhower doctrine. And therefore, the partnership between the USA and Israel officially started in 1967, right? And it's pure politics, right? It's pure politics, and it's a nasty piece of work.
So if the US had that kind of relationship with Israel because of the Eisenhower doctrine, then is that not something that Abdel Nasser took into account before attacking Israel? Or did he not think that the US would back Israel?
He thought that the US would not back Israel. He felt that the US on this instance will be on their side because the US incited them to go against British and French interests with regards to the Suez. So Abdel Nasser, poor political play. And I'm not sure how well this presents, but this was Israel before the war of 67. And this was Israel after the war. So Israel managed to go north and take does anybody know this region? The Golan Heights, and then into Sinai, which is in Egypt, right? So they lost a large proportion of their land, right? A large proportion of their land.
Just to add from the question from before, there was a crisis with the Suez Canal in 1957. Obviously Egypt wasn't doing well at the time, and so they wanted to nationalize the canal, and there was an issue with that.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about that particular issue in 2 sessions time, inshallah, because I call that intellectual trends, but you'll see that the rise of communism, capitalism, and Islamism in the Muslim world. So you had the so this was the 6-day war, and you had massive loss of lands. And then after that, you had, what you could call a little bit of revenge, okay? The Arabs then decided to carry out or enact revenge. And you had something called the Yom Kippur War, which was on the Jewish holiday, Yom Kippur. Essentially, this resulted in Anwar Sadat, who succeeded Gamal Abdel Nasser, right, who was next in line, and then you had Hafiz al-Assad, who was the father of Bashar al-Assad, right? He was the father of Bashar al-Assad. Both of them together decided at the time to try and create a 2-pronged attack on the occupier, the Israelis. And the mantra was that we're going to reclaim Palestine. We're going to take back the land for the Arabs. The reality was that they probably could have, right? They probably could have, because it was a surprise attack. There was destruction of Israeli tanks, there was destruction of aircraft carriers, and there was destruction of military bases. It was a sweeping offensive. However, that didn't happen. Right? That didn't happen because they weren't interested in quote-unquote freeing Palestine. The interest was in regaining the land that was lost in the 1967 war. Because you had, under the Eisenhower doctrine again, more supplies given to Israel, and you had the official creation of something called the Camp David Accords, right? Which was in Camp David in the United States of America, right? Which was between Israel and Egypt. And it was the first time there was recognition, or first, open time, there was recognition of a Middle Eastern ruler and the occupying entity, or Israel, right? By the way, in these negotiations, the Palestinians were not included. And also, in most negotiations, the Palestinians are not included, right? And when they are included, they're told to sit down quietly whilst America and Israel have a discussion. And all of this earned brownie points for the populations in Arab society. Oh yeah, our rulers are doing something. Oh yeah, we're going to get Palestine back. Didn't happen. Anwar Sadat essentially didn't talk about the right of return of the Palestinians, didn't talk about the returning of the lands to the Palestinians, didn't talk about connecting Gaza and the West Bank, didn't talk about any of these things. Essentially just said, can you give us Sinai back? Right? And then they got Sinai back. Anwar Sadat was subsequently assassinated. He was assassinated by a chap called Khalid Islambuli. Khalid Islambuli was asked, why did you kill Anwar Sadat? The video's on YouTube, by the way, yeah? And he was asked, why did you kill Anwar Sadat? Does anybody know what he said? He said, it was Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy al Munkar. That's what he said. The Arabs were angry. The Arabs were angry with Anwar Sadat. To translate, it means enjoining good and forbidding what is evil. Right? In Arabic. Right? Obviously, we don't condone it. Right? But this is how he felt. And he was a reflection of the Egyptian people at the time. Because people demanded his release at that time.
Do we know why Jordan didn't take part of the war to reclaim the West Bank?
Yeah. Does anybody know why Jordan didn't take?
Because Jordan was at the time backed by, they'd rebuilt their relationship with the British, while Syria and Egypt were only backed by the USSR.
That's the reason. Yeah. So Jordan were told to stay quiet. So some conclusions so far. The British, unfortunately, created the problem. So when somebody asks me about the Palestinian-Israeli crisis, I'm like, you know what, man? Ask politicians, right? Don't get me to condemn, right? Get your politicians to condemn. Because the situation was started by the powers that be. Palestinians were ignored from most negotiations during this time. The UN plan, there was no consultation of the Palestinians. There was consultation of the Arab states, by the way, but not the Palestinians. The UN ultimately acted as an extension of US policy in the region. The situation started as a two-state solution, but it was ultimately an unfair division to begin with. Terrorists became the heads of state overnight. That's not me saying it, that's multiple academics. The Arab countries are ultimately complicit with regards to the creation of Israel. The Palestinian resistance. The Palestinian resistance. And I'm going to talk about some organizations and some trends and other things, inshallah. The first is the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was ultimately a movement that was based in the West Bank. I'm just going to get my notes, which I think I've lost. No, I've got them. Which is ultimately, which was initially a resistance movement. The PLO were a resistance movement, and they largely based themselves not within the West Bank, rather they based themselves in southern Lebanon, in Jordan, and in Syria. Ultimately, for the Arab rulers, they had to be seen as doing something for the Palestinian cause, based on the sentiments of their population, because they're Muslims, right? And they're Arabs, right? And the expectation is there, right? So what they did was that they funded insurgencies. They funded the PLO. And the PLO caused a little bit of havoc. It existed to try and disrupt activity of the Israelis and to try and increase some, try to regain land. It wasn't very, very successful at doing that. However, the PLO started to lose support from a lot of the Arab states that previously funded it, right? And you had a number of different wars. So for example, the southern Lebanese, the first southern Lebanese and Israeli war happened, which was as a result of trying to get rid of the PLO, right? And you had horrific massacres take place, right? Has everybody heard of the massacre in Sabra? Right? Does anybody know what happened?
Was it when Lebanese Christian militias massacred a bunch of refugees?
Absolutely. It was Israeli militia, it was Israeli groups protected by Lebanese militias, completely massacred people in southern Lebanon, right? Where you had innocent civilians. Estimating of up to 3,200 people killed in Lebanon in one night. In a single night, right? And I'm not going to read the reports and the testimonies of the journalists that went the night after, but it's horrific, right? Women, children, etc. were killed. And that was, by the way, orchestrated by Ariel Sharon, who was the Prime Minister of Israel in 2001. So the Arab regimes then started to clamp down on the PLO, including Jordan, right? Jordan tried to get rid of the PLO, right? Because the PLO were being seen as disrupted. The PLO then subsequently became a little bit more official, and they decided to go onto the negotiating table. And that culminated in what is called the Oslo Agreements, or the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accord was started in 1993. And on Saturday, I actually went to a talk by somebody called Dr. Azam Tamimi. If anybody doesn't know Azam Tamimi, he's definitely worth following. He's authored a number of different books on the Palestinian issue. He's an academic and an authority in it. And he came up to good old Leeds, which was very nice. And then I kind of said to him, I'm from London. He said, oh, you moved all the way here? I said, yeah. And then I told him I'm doing this, and he goes, you're driving all the way to Sheffield? I was like, yeah. But I guess in London things are a little bit closer. But just a little bit. But, and he said, and he was correct, he said this was the destruction of the Palestinian resistance. The Oslo Accords was probably the worst thing that could happen to the Palestinians over the last 75 years. The first thing was that the PLO became the PA. The PLO became absorbed into the PA, but firstly it joined with a political organization, a secular political organization known as Fatah, right? And this became the official government of the West Bank and Gaza Strip initially. The West Bank was divided into three areas. Area A, which was Palestinian control, Area B, which is joint control, and Area C, which is the majority of the area, which is Israeli control. The Palestinians cannot have their own army. They cannot control their borders. They cannot control what goes in and out. They cannot control their how their property is allocated. In Area C, they cannot own property. In Area B, they got to go through multiple hoops. In the end, they never get property, right? And really, the fate of Gaza was subsequently handed over to the Israelis. In addition to that, because they have no standing army and no authority at all, the settlers were just allowed to come in. The agreement was that the Israeli army can walk into the West Bank, Area A, B, and C, whenever it wanted. Right? And that's when the problems that we see in terms of the settlements, the displacements, etc. started as a result of the Oslo Accords. Right? La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. We move on to Hamas.
It's essentially the disarmament of a whole, the Palestinians' right to have an army. Isn't that similar to what happened after Versailles? With how they were limited to 100,000 troops and they couldn't have ships or anything, and essentially they lost the Rhineland as well as major parts of their lands and those were formed into different countries.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The difference is that it's a moot point really, but the difference is here they weren't allowed to have anything, right? And we've seen it in many places. Japan is another example. After World War II, right? Restrictions, even banning for a number of years as an example. But ultimately, it just means that you have no security over your area. And this was a way to ultimately control the Palestinians, right? And to subjugate them further. And by the way, this is all part of the two-state proposition, right? This is no different. This is part of the two-state proposition. So when politicians are like, two-state solution, this is it, right? This is it. So then you had the establishment of Hamas. And yes, Hamas is the organization that is under scrutiny, right? And the key point here is that democracy can easily become undemocratic, right? It's a farce. It's a facade. Because ultimately, political interests will always trump democracy. Because Hamas was established in 1987 during the first Intifada, and they were an offshoot of Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood. And they were voted by the people, and this is important, by the people based on a majority to form a government at the time, right? To form a government at the time. And to run the Palestinian territories, not just Gaza, by the way, Gaza and the West Bank, right? They were voted in by people in the West Bank and in Gaza. Ultimately, they were not to the liking of the, we're going to do whatever you tell us to do, Fatah, right? And subsequently, the EU, the USA, Russia froze all of the assets of Hamas. Mahmoud Abbas, who was the leader of Fatah, who had to leave based on the fact that Hamas was voted in, then subsequently gave himself constitutional powers. Right? Literally, like, you're about to go away and then, you know what, you can't even script stuff like this, right? And this is historically accurate and you can read about it. There's actually a good book, it's called Hamas, Unwritten Chapters. And essentially, Abbas leaves his office. Abbas then goes to his ministers, who were part of the previous government, and said, we need to insert a law that will make me second to the leader of the government. Right? So that happens at 11 p.m. Between 11 p.m. and the next day at 9 a.m., he then comes about and creates all of these different laws that weaken Hamas's ability to govern. Right? Of course, he is paid for, funded, ultimately, by, and this is known, by the EU at the time. Right? By the EU at the time. Israel then imposes an economic, physical and maritime blockade on Gaza, and ultimately has a policy of keeping Gaza on the brink of collapse, right? This is after they had left Gaza. Hamas was then subsequently formalized into a political and a military wing, right? In terms of Hamas themselves, right, they had a number of different demands when they were brought to power. They wanted to free Palestine. They wanted to, actually, there were reasons why they were brought to power. And this is important to recognize, because they were voted in by the people. They wanted to free Palestine, that was their first call. They could see the failure of the peace process, the Oslo Accords. They wanted to free Palestinian prisoners who numbered in their thousands in Israeli jails, right? These were civilians. They wanted a withdrawal of Israel prior from Gaza, which Israel did. They were also a grassroots organization, right? If anybody knows Ikhwan al-Muslimin, they are ultimately a grassroots organization. They were much better at Fatah than organizing, and this is statistically proven, schools, hospitals. A lot of the hospitals and the schools that you see bombed were set up by Hamas prior to Hamas being elected, right? They were a grassroots organization, right? And ultimately, and this is also important, they were not secular, right? They said that they were an Islamic organization, and that holds a lot of mileage with a Muslim population, naturally. But ultimately, they weren't allowed to rule, right? So, where's democracy there?
Why did Israel pull out of Gaza?
I'll come to that later, inshallah. Remember it.
I'm not sure I really get why the PLO agreed to the Oslo Accords, or did they have no choice?
I'm not sure I get it either.
I think there was a question asked about what it meant to be in an open-air prison. So I think, so rather than it being just strictly the land, it's also maritime as well.
Yes.
Because I believe it's like 70, they can't go beyond 70 kilometers.
Correct. Off the coast. Yeah. And it became a prison. You know, you had loads of fences erected, and you had all of these different things, you know, done. And Hamas ultimately became Gaza ultimately became a prison. Today. And we come to the end, inshallah. The latest deal, as part of the peace plan, is something called the deal of the century. And it is actually termed as the deal of the century. But is also known as the Abraham Accords. It was announced after the visits of Donald Trump's son-in-law to the Arab world, including Bahrain, the UAE, Oman, Qatar, Saudi, Morocco, and Egypt. Essentially the Arab world. And the plan was as follows. Jerusalem was announced as the capital of Israel, right? And the US embassy was moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, Al-Qudus. You had recognition of the already built illegal Jewish settlements. So the ones that were already built around, within the Gaza Strip, right, became recognized. They became recognized.
West Bank.
Sorry?
In West Bank?
Sorry, West Bank. Within West Bank, they became recognized, right? I mean, to soften the blow, they said we're going to hold the building of new settlements for the next 10 years, right? But ultimately, it's empty promises, right? So you had so now you've got a further fracturing of Palestinian territory. Israeli sovereignty over the Jordan Valley, right? Which is just here. This area here. Which further cuts the West Bank from Jordan, right? No right of return, by the way. No right of return. And of course, once again, by the way, the Palestinians were ignored. There was no discussion with anyone with red skin, Palestinians. The result of it, and the long of short of it, is that 50% of the West Bank essentially gets handed over in exchange for a disjointed Palestinian state, right? So you're reducing the land even further, right, through this. And this is dubbed as the deal of the century. To put it into pictorial form, you know that Area C, which is under Israeli control, essentially remains under Israeli control. So all that's left is Area A and Area B. Okay? That's the easiest way to see it. Let's talk about the international community. That's the international community. That is the international community. It's the United States of America, it's Europe, and it's Australia, right? And Japan, just about, right? That is the international community. So let's talk about the international community. The United Nations, as we mentioned, was built off the back of the League of Nations, and ultimately was defined to work as an extension of US foreign policy. 5 nations were given powerful seats during UN negotiations. And there's an important distinction to make. And the distinction is between the General Assembly and the Security Council. Because you know, when people see that the UN has voted on this and the UN has voted on that, the UN has said it, therefore it must happen, it's a misnomer. It's a misunderstanding, ultimately, of how the UN works. The UN has a General Assembly and it has a Security Council. Does anybody know the difference between the two? Does anybody else know the difference between the two? Sorry? Yes, that's one difference. Security Council has veto powers. So 5 countries are given the right to veto. In other words, nothing is passed if one of these countries veto. Any other difference?
For the Security Council, there's only 5 permanent members.
Correct.
The rest have to get voted in.
Correct. There's 5 permanent members of the Security Council, so they can't be shifted, right? They can't be shifted. It's all about democracy, right, guys? They can't be shifted.
Control of UN actual security personnel, so where UN troops go, what the UN backs NATO to do.
Correct. Fine, absolutely. The other important distinction is that a resolution passed through the Security Council is binding. The General Assembly is 192 countries that are elected. 192 countries. But the resolutions are not binding. So you know UN Resolution 181 in 1947, which decided that this much land is going to Israel and this much land is going to Palestine. It's a General Council Assembly resolution. It's non-binding. There is no legal obligation to split the region according to that resolution. The only Security Council resolutions were called on in 1967 for the withdrawal of the Arab troops, right, during the 67 wars, and in 1973 for further negotiations. Those were binding. The rest of all of the negotiations that we see, none of them are binding. None of them actually have any meaning when it comes to the future of not just Palestine, of any state. Kashmir is another example. 3 UN General Assembly resolutions, and it still remains, it is the Palestine of the subcontinent. There's no difference. It is the Palestine of the subcontinent. The Rwandan genocide, right, between the Hutus and the Tutsis, right? This was massacre upon massacre. Iraq, weapons of mass destruction. The UN went in and said, there are no weapons of mass destruction. But guess what? The 5 permanent members voted on it. Or some of them. Right? There is unflinching support from Western governments. There is the blind provision of military aid. $3.8 billion of aid in 2020 from the United States of America. 5 million foreign aid, governmental foreign aid to support settlers. 6% increase in funding over the past decade. Like, I'm a doctor. You've seen how much we've been striking, right? We haven't got that. We've been trying very hard. But 6%, by the way, these are good figures, right? The United Kingdom, 442 million pounds worth of arms. And of course, you've got politicians that have supported, from all parties that have supported Israeli aggression, citing the right to defend itself and the right to cut off electricity and food supply under the first.
As well as that, apart from the actual governments, I know in America there's a lot of evangelical Christians in churches that do raise millions year in, year out.
Absolutely.
They send that straight to Israel as well.
The Conservative Party does it here, the youth organisations do.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of funding. The Muslim world. When the situation happened within Gaza, as in when it started to get bombed, the UAE called for a cessation of hostilities. Right? Egypt delayed opening of the Rafah crossing. I'm sure you guys saw yesterday that desperate Palestinians, out of desperation, had to take whatever food they could from the tankers. But this continues to be a delayed opening of the Rafah crossing. Saudi Arabia, you've got a policy of Saudi-Israeli normalization, right? Which is centered around the threat of Iran, where Saudi Arabia and Israel are trying to obtain a NATO-style pact, right? Or a separate pact, similar to US presence around South Korea, for example, where they're not part of NATO, but the US have promised to protect them from China. You've obviously got Neom City. I don't have a map, but Neom City is just under Israel, or just under Palestine, right? That's the new, the new major city around in Saudi Arabia that is there to try and get as many people into Saudi Arabia to work and to live. You've got the India, Israel, Saudi and Greece economic corridor, right? Which is the latest economic plan to try and create an alternative corridor. I'm going to take questions at the end now, inshallah. Then you have Turkey. And Erdogan has come out recently with quite blazing words. But his response initially was absolutely pathetic, right? Was absolutely pathetic, right? His response was, both sides are, in summary, both sides have mistakes, right? Both sides have had mistakes. And this is the reality of the situation today. This is settlers coming and taking land from innocent Palestinians who have lived there, and their ancestry dates back hundreds of years. Benjamin Netanyahu, only 2 months ago, going to the UN and presenting a new map of the Middle East, talking about normalization with the Arab world. So he's highlighted Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Bahrain, UAE, as this is the new thing. This is the new cooperation in town. This is the economic corridor between India, the UAE, Saudi Arabia and Israel, into Greece and into Europe. And of course, this is 75 years of occupation. So what is the road ahead? There is a really strong narrative. And by the way, just so that it's on record, nobody condones the killing of innocent civilians. Nobody accepts that. Nobody wants that to happen. Nobody likes to see young children, young women, no matter where they are and who they are, no matter what faith they are, no matter where they are in the world, die. It's saddening, it's heartbreaking, right? It's incredibly sad. However, the reality is that the narrative is unilaterally one-sided, and it's against anybody who speaks out for the Palestinians. The Israelis maintain that there is the right of no return. There is right of return for Israelis, right? So if you're Jewish and you're from anywhere in part of the world and you can prove your Jewish citizenship, well, your Jewish ancestry, right? You can go back to Israel, which is really interesting because you're not Jewish if you're Jewish and you've converted to Islam, or you're Jewish and you've converted to Christianity, but you're Jewish if you're Jewish and you've become an atheist. You're still Jewish. Makes no sense, right? This is Israeli law. Actually, I'll take questions at the end, as I said. Then you have the Jewish right to the land, right? The Jewish right to the land. The argument is that well, this is the Zionist argument. It's not a Jewish argument, by the way, right? There are multiple, by the way, interviews with Jewish rabbis, right? That you can see. So, for example, I grew up in northeast London. I live close to a place called Stamford Hill, right? Which has a strong Jewish population, right? And most of the flags that you see you will never see an Israeli flag. Most of the flags that you see in Stamford Hill today are Palestinian flags, right? So we have to separate the narratives. We have to separate it, right? Our criticism is not against Jewish people, it's against the Zionist state. Jewish right to the land. The reality is, like I said, for the best part, I'm going to be generous, 1,800 years, right? There has not been a consolidated Jewish population within what is now called Israel. The Ashkenazi Jews, who are predominantly from Europe, who have over the last 75 years come to Israel, are not ethnically from there. They're Europeans. They've lived and resided in Europe for centuries, right? The actual ethnic people that are there, that are from Palestine, are the Palestinian people, right? And there's multiple studies that have showed this. This two-state solution, what's going to solve this? I don't know, and I'll be honest. But we've seen that at the moment, the entirety of the 75 years has been a two-state policy. The peace accords, the partitions, the intifadas, the destruction has all been as part of a two-state solution. Whilst the negotiations have always been one-sided, because the Palestinians, as I've proven, have always been ignored. And of course, the US and Europe don't even recognize Palestine as a state. Who is the victim and what is proportionate violence? Right? Subhanallah, la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. We're going to see, and subhanallah, Allah knows the future. But what is planned over the next day or two is going to lead to hundreds, if not thousands, of deaths in this hospital in northern Gaza, right? I was looking at, the interview. I don't know if anybody watched the interview from the doctors in the hospital, at Shifa hospital, from what I recall. And they said, look, we've got children and women and men here with serious limb-threatening, life-threatening injuries. Who goes to a place and tells you that you need to evacuate because we're going to bomb you, and then tells the rest of the world that this is us being good people? Right? We're telling these people that we're going to bomb them before we actually go and bomb them, knowing full well that there is no way that they're going to be able to get people out, hundreds of people out from this hospital and the surrounding areas in 24 hours or 48 hours. It's impossible. I work as a doctor. I work in emergency medicine. It takes 2 hours to get one patient out of a hospital, right? That's NHS independent, by the way. Yeah, it's not related to the NHS. But we're going to see. But the argument is what? They attacked us. These human beings are terrorists. These people are terrorists. The right to self-defense. This violence is an enactment of self-defense, is the argument. There is no self-defense. You're the occupier, right? You're the occupier. These people the Gazans are the ones that are going to be defending, right? The upper hand, the military upper hand, the civilizational upper hand is with Israel. So for Israel to say that this is our self-defense mechanism is absolutely silly, right? It's absolutely silly. And of course you have the facade of democracy, right? Because as you can see, there was no democracy when it came to the Palestinians. As the majority Zionist population subjugates the minority Palestinians. And we have to be in tune with the reality. وَقُولُوا قَوْلًا سَدِيدًا. No to Hamas historically, but yes to the Zionists who were an insurgency movement and then became the government the next day. Yes to Bashar al-Assad, the butcher of Syria, who was the world terrorist one day and then was shaking hands with world leaders the next day. Yes to the IRA, who were conducting targeted bombings in the UK, including the killing of Mountbatten, who were terrorists one day and became government the next day. But no to Hamas, by the way. Propaganda politics. And there is huge amounts of propaganda. And actually, back to the first point, selective democracy. Suella Braverman, I'm sure you guys all know, the Home Secretary. Waving a Palestinian flag might carry an offense. Saying certain chants in a protest may carry certain repercussions and offense. And there is a reality that as Muslims, and I need to make it clear, we unnecessarily and very shamedly self-censor ourselves. And there are many times where it's important not to self-censor yourself. Be open in your conversation. Be open in your position. The least that we can do for the people of Gaza is actually tell and speak the truth for them. That's the least. Look at the propaganda politics, and these are the levels of the fight that we have, by the way. The selective democracy, the propaganda politics. There's still not a single report that shows that babies were killed in the numbers that people were saying. It's not a single report. There's still not a single report to say that women were raped. None of that, right? In fact, media correspondents have come out and said, actually, it was wrong. It was wrong for us to say that. But the damage has already been done, right? The damage has already been done. Dehumanization is certainly a feature of secular Western colonial politics. Dehumanization. It happened in America, it happened in Australia, it happened in India, it happened in Africa, and it is happening in Gaza. I've shown you guys how Zionism was just an extension. And I'm not saying, by the way, that the average person is like this. Of course not. I'm not saying that, right? The average person is open to discussion, and it's important for us to do that. But what I mean is states and politicians and politics. We've got blackouts, media, electricity, journalists. Journalists are being killed. Who's going to be the people that are going to be able to tell people the truth? It's important to recirculate. So what if you get banned from Facebook? So what if you get banned from Instagram? Who cares? No one's following you anyway. You know what I mean? Who cares, right? Who cares if you get banned from Twitter? Nobody cares. A Palestinian man, I saw a video of him. He said, where are the Arabs? Where are the Muslims? Inna hisabahum fi yawm al-qiyamah. Indeed, their reckoning, their hisab is on the Day of Judgment. So we're going to say to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that, oh yeah man, well not man, but oh yeah, we're not going to, I don't want to share, I don't want my Facebook to get banned. You know, I don't want to get told off by my lecturer for being pro-Palestinian, right? I don't want to do this or do that. Those excuses don't add up. The rights to self-defense, proportionate response and collateral damage. These are human beings. You've got to see it from a human point of view. These are innocent men, women and children that are being massacred. These aren't people. Many of these people don't even know what a gun is. They don't know how to use a gun. They never even thought about using the gun. And you can talk about Hamas or Fatah or etc. You can condemn them, right? As much as you want. But there's not been a single word of condemnation. A single word of condemnation from the Palestinian people there. Not a single word. Not a single word of condemnation. Does that mean that they are all terrorists? Does that mean that they are all subject to collateral damage? Or just, collateral damage? In military terminology, do you know what they call it when they kill people from the air?
Collateral damage.
Splatting. When you splat a fly, right? When you splat a fly, they call it splatting. Right? There's somebody called Salah Sharif who did his PhD on the war in Iraq, and he's got a TED talk which is probably worth watching. And he explains it. It's called splatting. That's when about 5 to 10 people die. A huge splat is when it's more than 50 people that die. That is dehumanization. That is collateral. That is astaghfirullah. Anyway, you got my point. And then you've got the historical claims and anti-Semitism. We're not anti-Semitic. It didn't start off with us. There's nothing within our scripture that says we are. Right? It was a European problem. And the reality is that the European problem was transplanted to us. They made it our problem. Right? Jews were living in Palestine for many, many years. They were never prohibited from visiting the Holy Land. Never ever. And nor will they be. Right? Nor will they be. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَهِنُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا وَأَنْتُمُ الْأَعْلَوْنَ إِن كُنْتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. We're used to being the underdogs. We're used to it. David and Goliath. Before that, Nuh alayhi salam, with these people. After that, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the battle of Badr, the battle of Ahzab, even the battle of Uhud. We're used to being underdogs. The battle of Ain Jalut, the battle of Hittin. We were underdogs in every single one of these battles, every single one of these issues. But وَأَنْتُمُ الْأَعْلَوْنَ. We'll always win, Insha'Allah. It's in our belief. And the first thing you have to do, Insha'Allah, the first thing and the most easily accessible thing is to make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is to make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Supplicate to the creator of the heavens and the earth. Supplicate to Al-Qahar. Supplicate to the one who can change things like this. Then learn your history. Look into what's going on. Adopt the arguments that come our way that make the Palestinian struggle make the Palestinian struggle look bad, and say it clearly. Be uncompromising. Be respectful, but be uncompromising. Don't be duped by sweet words. What I mean by that is the sweet words of Piers Morgan. The sweet words of politicians. The sweet words of the rulers. The sweet words of the people who have the ability to change the situation. How much of an impact, subhanAllah, I was thinking about this, how much of an impact would simply cutting off oil make? It's non-aggressive. It's non-aggressive. It's just cutting off oil by the Arab rulers to the Zionist entity. How much of a difference would just cutting off water, 22% of which, by the way, comes from Turkey? Just not even shutting it off, by the way, right? Not even shutting it off, just reducing it a little bit. Present a counter narrative and involve yourself in halal causes. That's important, especially for the Muslims, of course. Has to be halal. We don't engage in vigilante justice, right? We don't engage in violence. We don't engage in racial slurring. We don't engage in any of these actions. What we engage in is what was permitted to us and what is permitted to us by Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Use alternative media. Attend lectures. Shout out to me. Speak with colleagues, right? Speak with colleagues. Speak with students. Speak at work. Visit, Insha'Allah, if you can, visit Al-Aqsa. Insha'Allah. Make niyyah, Insha'Allah. Visit Al-Aqsa. Visit Jerusalem. Show them, show the Muslims there that we care. And if you have Christian friends, tell them to go there too. Because it's not just the Muslims that get persecuted, by the way. It's Christians that get persecuted in Israel too. Tell them to go as well. And this is my reference list, inshallah. And I know I've taken longer, but I think the topic demanded that. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم وصلى الله على النبي.